Introduction: The Night Texas Froze. Welcome back to Historia Prime. February 2021. A polar vortex slams into Texas, a state built for 100-degree summers, not 10-degree winters. The power grid collapses overnight. 4.5 million homes go dark. Pipes burst. Furnaces die. Inside millions of bedrooms, the temperature drops below freezing. 246 people will die before it is over. In the chaos, news crews film families huddled under blankets in living rooms that have become walk-in freezers. And in nearly every frame, the villain is the same. Floor-to-ceiling windows, radiating cold into the room like open wounds. Heat pouring out, ice forming on the inside of the glass. But buried in the Reddit threads and survival forums that week, a handful of people posted something strange. They had taken sheets of rigid foam insulation from their garages, cut them to size, and pressed them into their window frames. Their rooms stayed 15 to 20 degrees warmer than their neighbors. Some of them never lost livable temperature at all. They had stumbled onto a fix that costs $20, takes an afternoon to build, and can slash a heating bill by up to 40%. A fix that Northern European builders used for 5 centuries. A fix that a Manhattan Project physicist spent the last decades of his life proving to a world that refused to listen. So why has almost nobody heard of it? Today on Historia Prime, we are going to pull this buried idea back into the light. We will follow it from medieval Scandinavia to the secret labs of World War II to the strictest building codes on the planet. And by the end, you will know exactly how to build it yourself. Let us begin. Part 1. The hole in every house. To understand why those Texans' foam trick worked so well, we need to talk about a number most people have never heard of: the R value. R value measures thermal resistance, how hard it is for heat to pass through a material. The higher the number, the better the insulation. It is the single most important number in building science, and the building industry would prefer you never learn to use it because the moment you do, you see the scam. Your walls, if your house was built to modern code, have an R value somewhere between R13 and R21. That is, fiberglass or foam packed tightly between wooden studs, wrapped in weather barriers, sealed behind drywall. Your walls are doing their job. Now look at your window. A single-pane window has an R value of 1. A standard double-pane window reaches 2, and the most expensive triple-pane, argon-filled, low-E coated window that a salesman will spend 45 minutes trying to sell you, about 5. The wall is R13. The window is R1. Your window insulates at less than 1/10 the capacity of the wall it sits in. Picture this. Someone takes a chainsaw, cuts a 12-square-foot hole right through the middle of your living room wall, and covers it with a sheet of aluminium foil. You would call that insane, but thermodynamically, that is what every standard window does to your home's defenses. During the day, sunlight streaming through the glass provides passive solar heating, which partially offsets the loss. But the moment the sun sets, the equation flips completely. Your windows become one-directional thermal drains. For 8 to 12 hours a night, across 5 months of winter, your furnace burns gas, oil, or electricity to push heat into a room, and your windows radiate that heat straight into the freezing sky. The Department of Energy has measured this precisely. Windows account for 25 to 30% of all residential heating energy loss. 1/4 to 1/3 of your heating bill is flying out through the glass. You paid for that heat, and your windows gave it away for free. Now here is the question nobody in the building industry wants you to ask. If the window is this bad, why is the only approved fix a $15,000 to $30,000 window replacement? Part 2. The 500-year-old survival secret. Our ancestors did not need an R-value chart to understand this problem. They had something more persuasive than a digital thermometer. They had frostbite. 500 years before anyone coined the phrase R-value, Builders across northern Europe had already solved the thermal hole, not with expensive technology, but with a daily ritual. If you were a medieval farmer in Scandinavia, a merchant in Bavaria, or a blacksmith in Tudor England, a drafty window was not an inconvenience, it was a survival threat. You woke in the dark. You checked if the water in the bucket had frozen overnight. If it had, someone in the house might not survive the week. The solution was the shutter, but not the flimsy, decorative plastic rectangles bolted to the sides of modern American suburban homes. The ones that do not move, do not close, and serve no function whatsoever except to signal that a house was built after 1955. The real shutters were serious equipment. In Scandinavia, they were called lukora. In Germany, Fensterladen. In France, volets. They were thick wooden panels mounted on iron hinges, often lined with sheepskin or packed with layers of straw. They swung shut from the inside or the outside, and when latched, they trapped a layer of dead air against the glass, while the wood, leather and fibre stopped heat loss cold. Closing the shutters at sundown was not a choice. It was as automatic as bolting the door. From Stockholm to Somerset, from the Swiss Alps to the Scottish Highlands, this was universal practice. Humans understood a basic truth about the physical world. A solid panel across a window opening keeps the heat inside. So what happened? Why did we stop? In the late 1800s, coal-fired central heating arrived and changed human behavior almost overnight. If a furnace in the basement could continuously replace whatever heat the window lost, people no longer had to manage their environment. The shutter went from essential survival gear to a forgotten relic in a single generation. Cheap, abundant fossil fuels let us pretend the laws of physics no longer applied. As the 20th century progressed, glass got cheaper and bigger. Picture windows, bay windows, floor-to-ceiling walls of light became the hallmark of modern architecture. From the mid-century ranch houses of California to the glass towers of Manhattan. The industry sold openness as a lifestyle. A thick, opaque, insulating panel blocking that beautiful view directly contradicted the marketing. And so we forgot the medieval builder. We traded 5 centuries of resilience for the comfort of a gas bill. Part 3. The atomic physicist who rediscovered the peasant's secret. It took a man who understood the fundamental building blocks of the universe to rediscover what medieval farmers already knew. His name was William Shercliffe. Shercliffe was not a building contractor, he was a Harvard physicist. During World War II, he was recruited into the Office of Scientific Research and Development, serving directly under Vannevar Bush on the Manhattan Project. His specific assignment was as a patent censor. He scoured the country for any private invention related to atomic energy and locked it away in total secrecy to protect the bomb's development. After the war, he served as the official historian for Operation Crossroads, the nuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946. He watched a 23-kiloton bomb vaporize a fleet of warships from a distance of a few miles. That experience changed him. Family members later said that the entire second half of his long life was an act of atonement. The man who had helped weaponize the atom turned his intellect entirely toward sustainable energy, solar architecture, and human survival. By the late 1970s, America was in the grip of the energy crisis. Oil prices were spiking. Families were rationing heat. Shercliffe looked at the American house with a physicist's eyes and immediately saw the obvious flaw: the windows. For a man who had measured energy in megatons, calculating the heat loss through a pane of residential glass was trivial. But what he found embarrassed him, not because the answer was complex, but because it was painfully simple, and the entire building industry was ignoring it. You could achieve the same effect as a medieval sheepskin shutter using modern, dirt-cheap materials. Take a panel of rigid foam insulation, the kind available at any hardware store for a few dollars. Cut it to fit the inside of your window frame. Wrap it in fabric, apply magnetic tape to the edges of the panel and matching tape to the window casing. At night, press it into the frame. The magnets snap shut, creating a near airtight seal. In the morning, pull it off. The whole operation takes 5 seconds. Shercliffe tested this with absolute scientific rigor. A single 1-inch panel of rigid foam delivers an R value of 5 to 6.5. Press it into a single-pane window and you combine the foam's resistance with the glass and the trapped dead air layer between them. Your R1 window is now operating at R8, instantly outperforming the most expensive triple-pane window on the market. Use a 2-inch panel and you reach R13 to R15. You have matched the insulation of your solid walls. The weakest point in your house is eliminated. In 1980, Shercliffe published his findings in a book called Thermal Shutters and Shades. Over 100 designs, hinged panels, sliding boards, magnetic pop-in foams. Every design tested, every claim mathematically proven. Every solution buildable by an amateur for under $30. Nobody in the scientific community could challenge the physics. The numbers were airtight. And then the book quietly disappeared, out of print within a decade. By 2010, it had become an obscure collector's item, selling for over $100 among underground building science enthusiasts. When William Shercliffe died in 2006, at the age of 97, the window industry he had challenged was worth $20 billion a year. How does a proven, cheap, physically flawless solution simply vanish? To answer that, we need to follow the money. Part 4. The $20 billion reason. Here is the thing. You do not need a smoke-filled room of scheming executives to bury a technology. You just need market incentives pointed in the wrong direction. The modern window industry is built entirely on one business model: the replacement cycle. Companies like Anderson, Peller, and Marvin sell you insulated glass units, double or triple panes, separated by a gap filled with argon or krypton gas, held together by rubberized perimeter seals. And yes, these are vastly better than single-pane glass. That part is not in dispute. But here is what the salesman will not mention. Those seals are under constant stress. Every summer, the glass expands. Every winter, it contracts. After 15 to 20 years, the seals fail. The argon leaks out. Moisture creeps in and permanently fogs the glass. The R value drops. And what does the homeowner do? They call the same company and spend another $15,000 to $20,000 replacing the windows all over again. Anderson alone generates over $3 billion a year from this cycle. Now imagine introducing Shercliffe's $20 magnetic foam panel into this ecosystem. There is almost no profit margin. You cannot build a billion-dollar business selling foam board and magnets. It requires no professional installation, which means contractors lose millions in labor fees. And worst of all for the industry, it breaks the replacement cycle entirely. If you use a thermal shutter at night, it does not matter if the argon leaked out of your old 1990s double-pane window. The foam does the heavy lifting. You no longer need new windows to stay warm. A $20 fix is not a competing product. To a $20 billion industry, it is an existential threat. But the real burial did not happen in a boardroom. It happened in the regulatory system. In the 1990s, the EPA launched Energy Star, and the National Fenestration Rating Council standardized window performance ratings. These programs were designed to certify manufactured products, permanent factory-built objects bolted to a house. They were never designed to certify human behavior. Think about that for a moment. There is no NFRC rating for a homeowner who responsibly places a cheap foam panel in the window every evening. The rating system literally cannot see this solution. It does not have a category for it. Because building codes and energy certifications only recognize expensive, permanent manufactured glass, architects and builders stopped thinking about movable insulation altogether. A solution that works perfectly in the physical world was regulated out of existence in the bureaucratic one. It was pushed to the fringes, into off-grid communities, DIY survivalist forums, and the dusty shelves of a few building science obsessives. The system did not conspire to suppress the thermal shutter. The system was simply never built to recognize it. And when the only tools you have are designed to measure expensive glass, every problem looks like it needs a new window. Part 5. The Passive House Proof. But physics does not care about bureaucracies, and the vindication of William Shercliffe and of those medieval Scandinavian builders finally arrived from the strictest building science laboratory on Earth, Germany. In the 1990s, a German physicist named Wolfgang Feist asked a radical question. What is the absolute minimum energy a building needs to remain perfectly comfortable year-round, without relying on a massive central furnace? His answer became the passive house standard. And to call it energy efficient is a wild understatement. A certified passive house uses up to 90% less heating energy than a standard American home. It is so heavily insulated and so airtight that it can be kept warm in the dead of winter by the body heat of the people living inside, the warmth from the refrigerator, and the residual heat from cooking. There are now tens of thousands of certified passive house buildings worldwide, and if you look closely at how these cutting-edge structures are engineered, you will discover something remarkable. Even in a passive house, using the absolute best, most expensive, low-E triple-pane windows that German engineering can produce, the window is still the weakest thermal link. So what do the passive house engineers do? They use thermal shutters. In modern German and Austrian passive houses, as the sun sets, automated exterior roller shutters or interior insulated panels slide silently across the windows. They lock into place with brush gaskets, forming an airtight seal. The window's R value jumps from R6 to R15. The heat stays inside. The building holds its warmth like a thermos. The Fraunhofer Institute for Building Physics in Stuttgart measured this precisely. Deploying an insulated shutter over a modern window reduces nighttime heat loss by 62 to 80%. 500 years ago, a Bavarian farmer called it a Fensterladen. Today, a German physicist calls it a thermal shutter. The principle has not changed in half a millennium. The laws of thermodynamics have not been updated. The most scientifically rigorous building standard in human history proved what the medieval peasant already knew. A solid panel across a window keeps the heat inside. Period. Part 6. Build it yourself. The $20 fix. So now you know the history, you know the physics, you know why this was buried. The only question left is, how do you actually build one? Before we get to the recipe, let us quickly understand why a piece of foam outperforms a $1,000 window. Your windows lose heat through 3 physical modes simultaneously. Conduction, heat traveling directly through solid material. Glass is dense and conducts heat easily. Foam is mostly trapped air bubbles, and heat struggles to pass through it. Radiation, your warm body and furniture radiate invisible infrared energy straight out through the glass into the cold night. And convection, the real killer. Warm air from your room hits the freezing glass, drops in temperature, sinks to the floor, and pulls more warm air down after it. This creates a relentless, invisible waterfall of cold air pouring off your windows all night. A magnetic foam panel stops all 3. The foam blocks conduction. If you use foil-faced foam, the foil bounces infrared radiation back into the room. And the magnetic seal, that is the secret weapon, paralyzes the convection loop entirely by preventing warm air from ever reaching the cold glass. Here is the exact recipe. Step 1. Go to any hardware store and buy a sheet of rigid foam insulation. EPS, expanded polystyrene, is the cheapest option. XPS, Extruded polystyrene, usually pink or blue, is better. Polyisocyanurate, or PIR, usually foil-faced, is the best. Step 2. Measure the inside of your window frame carefully. Cut the foam with a utility knife so it fits snugly, leaving about a 1/4-inch gap on all sides. Step 3. Wrap the foam in a breathable fabric. Cotton or canvas works perfectly. Secure it with a staple gun or spray adhesive. This turns a piece of construction material into something that looks like a decorative panel. Step 4. Apply adhesive-backed magnetic strips to the interior frame of your window. Apply the matching strips to the edges of your fabric-wrapped panel. Step 5. At sundown, press the panel into the window. It snaps into place. In the morning, pull it off and let the light back in. 5 seconds each way. For 10 windows, this will cost you roughly $200 to $300 and one Saturday afternoon. If your annual heating bill is $2,000, these panels can save you up to $800 per year. They pay for themselves in the first month of winter. Now, 2 honest caveats, because trust matters more than hype. First, the condensation issue. Your foam panel keeps room heat away from the glass so effectively that the glass itself gets extremely cold. If your magnetic seal has gaps, warm, moist air from breathing and cooking will seep behind the panel, hit the freezing glass, and condense into water. Over time, that moisture can damage wooden frames. The fix is simple. Make the magnetic seal tight, or press the foam directly against the glass so no air gets trapped. Second, thermal shutters only work when they are in place. During the day, if you want natural light, the panel comes off, and your window goes back to being an R1 hole. This is a nighttime and away-from-home solution. It does not replace good windows. It makes any window dramatically better when the sun is not shining. Honest about the limitations, clear about the physics. That is how you know this is real. Conclusion: reclaiming the blueprint. The knowledge has been there all along. For 500 years, Northern Europeans survived the ice and snow with it. In 1980, an atomic physicist mapped the mathematics. Today, the world's elite green architects depend on it to build zero-energy homes. The physics have never been in dispute. The only thing in dispute is whether you are supposed to find out. The building code was designed to certify products, not people. The window industry was designed to sell replacements, not solutions. And so, every winter night, while you sleep, your naked windows radiate your money into the freezing dark. But here is what no regulatory framework and no billion-dollar corporation can take from you: the ability to walk into a hardware store, spend $20, and fix the problem yourself. When you build a thermal shutter, when you take that piece of foam, wrap it in fabric, and snap it into your window frame as the wind howls outside, you are doing more than cutting your heating bill. You are stepping outside of a system that was never designed to help you. You are reclaiming the survival instincts of your ancestors. You are proving that common sense and a few dollars can outsmart a $20 billion industry. In February 2021, a family in Texas survived the deadliest winter storm in a generation with a piece of foam and a roll of magnetic tape. Tonight, when the temperature drops, you have the same choice they had. What other simple, historical solutions are hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to rediscover them? If this deep dive gave you something valuable, hit the subscribe button. Share this video with anyone who dreads their winter heating bill. And if you want to know what other survival technologies the modern world forgot, the archive is waiting for you on this channel. Stay curious, stay warm, and remember, history is not just in the past. It is the blueprint for your future. See you next time on Historia Prime.